Good afternoon. Having come to the last session, after having a lot of discussion on pediatric oncology throughout the day, an allied specialty pediatric hematology. What do pediatric hematology got to do with surgeons? We're spending 1 hour on pediatric hematology for surgeons. If you probably look at it, we could get an odd referrals for splenectomy or for or reference for splenectomy, for ITP or thalassemia, and not much other than that. So the two topics which was chosen was one, bleeding diathesis for surgeons and rational use of blood and blood products in surgery. Bleeding diathesis, if you ask pediatric surgeons who have been practicing for a long time, how many patients, routine pediatric surgical patients, they had problem with unexpected massive bleeding during the practice over years, it would probably be none or a handful of them. So why are we worried about bleeding diathesis in children? There are broadly two groups of surgeons, some who would do routine evaluation for all pediatric surgical patients, doing a panel of coagulopathy evaluations, and the other group would never do for routine surgical cases. If you ask the first group, by doing routine evaluation for bleeding diathesis in your general surgical practice, how many did you actually pick up having some abnormality who didn't have obvious history or any other indication to do this test? Or if you ask this other group of surgeons who operate without getting these investigations done, how many of them had unexpected bleeding causing trouble, making you regret that protocol? The answers to both would probably be negligible or none. So why are we then worried so much about doing so much of work on bleeding diathesis, so much of investigations on bleeding diathesis? In the present day scenario, having one unanticipated or unexplained problem is enough morally to make it depressing for you for quite few number of days or weeks or months, but more importantly, medico-legally cause you enough trouble to probably change the whole personality of the person or his family and associated members because of the legal issues involved. So with this background, I'll just try to ask a few questions with this different group of panelists who are here, try to get some answers of the common questions which come up in either academic or general practice when we are looking at general pediatrics, surgical problems, patients, preoperative evaluations, etc. Nitin, the first question goes to you. As pediatric surgeons, how many times have you actually encountered unexplained bleeding in your surgical practice? Or have you heard of any of your colleagues or friends talking to you about these?
So I think you've already answered that question. That as I think in a busy surgical center, it would depend upon two things. It would depend upon the type of patients you're dealing with, and it would depend upon whether it's a busy OPD kind of a practice or it's a different subset of patients. So in a OPD practice where we're doing daycare surgeries or simpler surgeries that you would put in, I don't think we really come across anything which is a significant number in sense of the incidence. However, if you look at complex problems like hepatobiliary problems, tumors, and you look at other issues like portal hypertension, then obviously the incidence of these coagulopathies and things increase considerably. So we need to have a broad guideline in your practice how to decide which patients to investigate and which not to investigate. That's right.
So do you have any sort of departmental policy, either your department or the anesthesia department of institution or your institutional policy as general, who have fixed pre-op guidelines for these patients as far as bleeding diathesis evaluation is concerned?
So I think all patients, be it a daycare surgery or a inpatient something, they undergo a thorough pre-anesthesia evaluation, and the anesthetists generally have the pediatric anesthesia unit in our hospital. In conjunction with us, we have a policy that I think more relevance is given on clinical examination and history taking, and they have their own subset of questionnaires which are very popular amongst the anesthesia colleagues, and they are able to make out the predicted value of these questionnaires is quite significant, and you can actually pick out which patients to investigate. So for a simple patient, if we classify them as a daycare, hypospadias, or a hernia surgery, I think a simple hemoglobin is what is done, and other investigations like X-rays and all if required. For patients who would be requiring any visceral surgery or something, also hemoglobin may be a complete blood count, and that's where we would stop. And definitely for the other group like hepatobiliary and other groups, we would go ahead and do a full coagulogram, which would include a PT, PTTK, an INR, and retics and film. So we classify according to the PSC, we get a good history, and we decide that these are the subset of patients which need a complete coagulogram workup, and these are the patients who don't. And I think our 80% of patients would fall in the group which do not require a complete coagulogram workup.
I mean, trying to make guidelines, you try to make different institutions have different group of people. I mean, this specialist to determine who's the boss. So you decide to make a guideline, and the anesthetist said, no, I want these things. Then we said, let us follow the anesthetist, and you agree. The anesthetist insists on pediatric clearance, and the pediatrician comes up with their own guidelines, and ultimately nothing gets followed, and it's all left to each group or institution to frame. Dr. Vikramjit, as an hematologist, what would you recommend in evaluating routine pediatric surgical patients for coagulopathy?
So what I'm used to with routine patients essentially is a good history and physical, which should, in about 90+% patients, tell you if further testing is needed. As far as testing goes, the bare minimum you might need is hemoglobin, a CBC if you want to push it, but in general, my old boss used to say, never do a test unless you know what the result is going to be. And we get far more referrals from people who've had inappropriate testing done. They've had coagulograms done with too little blood and too much anticoagulant. Then their PTT is mildly elevated. Then they go to a hematologist. Then they end up going in circles. But you can tell, as so correctly pointed out, patients who have comorbidities, patients who have other associated medical problems are then going to need screening to ensure somebody, for example, who has potential liver disease, potential renal disease, is going to need a creatinine or an SGPT or liver function testing. But the difficulties arise when you have pre-anesthesia testing, where there's smorgasbord. Basically, they've decided ahead of time that every patient should get this, and that, because we once had a patient 10 years ago where this happened. And that's where I think some departments get into problems. So it should be driven by a history, physical, and based on that you decide if further lab testing is needed.
I think two very important points you raise. One is about getting abnormal values more because of technical reasons and lab collection problems, and especially when you deal with pediatric patients, we do have problems in collecting the right amount of blood volume, which is supposed to be collected for the vials. They do come up with pediatric vials, but many of them do not have the amount of anticoagulant. So there are a lot of technical issues. And again, asking for things which you wouldn't have benefit. Sometimes we used to have this policy of doing hemoglobin. Sometimes the patient used to come back with a CBC report. Then suddenly the anesthetist started saying, you have an absolute eosinophil current is very high, so we are going to cancel your case. Yep. So, which we never would have looked at otherwise. Yeah. So these are certain unnecessary investigations which add on, which have no meaning. Right. Is there any difference in protocol which you would plan for, depending on whether it's an emergency surgery or a routine surgery, but the same type of surgery? For example, if it was a routine hernia versus an obstructed or a strangulated hernia, same type of surgeries, but when they present in a routine versus an emergency situation.
It'll depend what the emergency is. So I'll pass it back to my surgical colleague. If it's trauma, for example, and you're concerned about DIC?
Yeah, so obviously if it's a strangulated hernia with sepsis and gangrene, impending gangrene, then we'll look for parameters of DIC and go in probably for a coagulogram, try to get the correct blood products arranged before surgery. So it all depends on the emergency surgery which is being undertaken, and like a simple daycare hernia versus a strangulated hernia or a gangrenous hernia, probably the amount of investigation would be same, even though you would be going ahead with the surgery anyways. There's no choice over there. It's just kind of being ready for the post-operative or the perioperative period with the correct blood products and the correct perioperative care. So that's what I think we need to do.
Dr. Shekhar, like we were discussing in the beginning, when you looked at the actual problems over years many people would have faced, it's very negligible. So what is the actual incidence of these coagulopathies in general practice which you would see?
So,
are they alarming? Or?
It's a very difficult question to answer because coagulopathies is I mean, if we talk of the hemostasis of the hemostasis mechanism, it includes platelets and the clotting system and also the vascular system. So it's very difficult to give a broad brush to this question. But may I answer it slightly indirectly? So I have 2 points just to add to what Dr. Peters and Dr. Kanwar has said. Number one is I think one of the most important things is the knee-jerk practice of bleeding time and clotting times. I think these tests are outdated and should not be prescribed. So I exhort colleagues to avoid doing this testing. Second is the history, and I would just like to point the history that Dr. Peters had mentioned. It's just a directed history. So his history of hemostatic challenges in life. So a newborn baby born, the cord separation, I think that's an important hemostatic challenge. If vacuum extraction or forceps extraction, another hemostatic challenge. In young babies, when they're having teeth eruption or vaccinations, another time when they had a hemostatic challenge. When they walk, bruising. And then in the older adults, it's actually the sport-related injuries, dental extractions, and in older patients, it's the menorrhagia in women. So there is a direct history in the family history. In my opinion, these are sufficient information for clotting abnormalities. The answer for the specific question of frequency, if you're talking of hemophilia, is a very rare problem. Sangeeta?
I just wanted to add up in the history. Delayed bleeding. Like you get a trauma today and then you bleed later on. That is also a very important history to elicit.
Correct. Yes.
So I think we were stressed on all the points about history and anything specific in the general physical examination you would...
So yes, so the general physical examination, I think essentially we're looking for evidence of spontaneous hemorrhages. They're very unlikely to happen. In the pediatric hematology setting, in the pediatric cancer setting, I think the physician will be looking at seeing what the platelet count is because these are pediatric cancer patients on chemotherapy. Aside from that, I think the signs of hemorrhage, cutaneous, mucosal, and internal. So I do not think any other specific, would you consider any other specific physical stigmata of hemostatic failure in patients? I do not think so. I do not think so. The only other thing just to, may I share an anecdote?
Sure.
So sometimes we receive hematology consultations. So one of the consultations I had was a patient who had a bicycle handle, blunt abdominal trauma, and came to emergency, and this patient's blunt abdominal trauma 48 hours ago and came with bleeding, so delayed bleeding. So in this situation, the clotting time was the prothrombin time was, so there was a hematoma behind the third part of duodenum, and the prothrombin time was very marginally elevated, maybe about 39 or 40 seconds beyond against a control of 25, 28. And for this particular patient, there was clearly, evidence of wound healing by secondary intention because this patient had a hemarthrosis and intervention for that. So that kind of physical examination for surgical scars, etc.
Dr. Sangeeta, to mention a case scenario, you have a 5-year-old child who has been admitted for surgery. Mother mentions that child has history of easy bruising. What are the specific investigations we would like to ask? So when now we have come to the stage that we are looking more of history and physical examination and then segregating the ones which require further evaluation. So what were the minimum things which we need to ask, and how do we proceed before we then go ahead with the surgery?
Okay, so history has been well covered by Shekhar, and any child who is coming with mainly skin bleeding or mucosal bleeding, I would think of platelet type of disorders. So in this case, I would look for the CBC and look for the platelet count. If the platelet count is normal, it doesn't mean that there is no abnormality in the platelet, because there can sometimes be platelet function defects as well. So I also need to see a peripheral smear. In the peripheral smear, I would look for the platelet size, because there are certain platelet type of bleeding disorders in which the platelet may be small, and there may be certain disorders like Glanzmann's thrombasthenia where the platelet size may be large. Also, there will be certain disorders where the platelets won't clump. So these things we would look in the peripheral smear. Apart from that, if I'm strongly suspecting that there could be a platelet function disorder, I will ask for platelet function studies. Also, von Willebrand factor presents like a mucosal kind of bleeding. So if I'm suspect platelet type of bleeding, so if there are mucosal or skin bleeds happening in a child repeatedly, I would definitely like to rule out von Willebrand factor abnormalities in that child.
So once we have this type of history...
Yeah. May I add just two more points here? So one thing is on the peripheral blood smear, the platelet examination to look for granules, and sometimes the gray platelets can be there. The other thing is that in our population, there is a condition called acquired platelet dysfunction with eosinophilia, where patients have striking bruising and bleeding with a high eosinophil count, often parasite-driven. So those patients can present with an acquired dysfunction of platelets, and sometimes addressing the cause of the eosinophilia with antihelminthic therapy can address this problem. So just a aside.
When we have this diagnosis, how would we proceed? We already have a patient, but we have to go ahead with the surgery. What are the precautions, and what do we need to keep?
Yes, so the management would depend on what kind of problem is it. So if there is a platelet function defect, you need to give that for the surgery, you need platelet transfusions. For von Willebrand factor, we'll have to find out what kind of von Willebrand factor deficiency is there. It's type 1, type 2, or type 3. So depending on that, the treatment would differ. So type 1 and type 3 are usually like quantitative defect, and type 2 has multiple types which are qualitative defect. So then depending on what the results come out, we decide the plan of management for that child.
Now coming to the other group, a child whose history and physical examination is normal.
So just my own knowledge, sorry, because I'm a semi-hematologist. So diagnosing type 2 defects in the Indian context, sort of how easy is it? We had von Willebrand factor concerns. We assumed it was type 1. Type 3 will behave almost like hemophilia because they're very low. Their carriage of factor 8 is low. Just throw that away, please. Just take it out. And then as far as type 2 goes, it's a functional defect, and those take a long time to work up, and it's really hard to do. So do we have, Shekhar, do we have access to that?
My answer to this, whenever you come into that territory, besides numerical disorders, I would refer to a center which has done these hemostatic function analysis as part, advanced hemostasis center. So for instance,
it's in Bombay, NIH does it, so we have access to that. Yeah.
So Mumbai is the place to send them.
Yeah, National
If you
Institute.
think it's type 2.
Yeah.
And hold the surgery for the moment.
Yeah, maybe, yeah.
Okay.
Because they might bleed. Yeah.
Another situation where a child underwent routine circumcision, his history and physical examinations had no reason to do a pre-op coagulopathy evaluation. Post-operatively, 4 hours later, there was complaint that there was excessive bleeding and repeated pressure dressings, and settled down with pressure dressing. There was no mechanical or surgical reason for the bleeding. So do we need to evaluate these children further? One. And if so, do we have to evaluate them during the acute episode, or do we need to do it at some time later?
So, if I am getting the question right, the child has bled excessively after circumcision. Pre-op investigations were not done for that.
Not done because the history and physical examination didn't warrant anything.
Okay, so yeah, at some point, sometimes it might happen, and we do need to evaluate these children, and they may be having disorders. It could be clotting disorders. We have had cases with child being circumscribed at a newborn period and later on found to be have hemophilia. There's no need to wait to evaluate. You can do the evaluation at that particular time also. So again, the basic screening at least we have to do, which will include the CBC, a peripheral smear, prothrombin time, APTT, and a thrombin time, and a fibrinogen level. That is the minimum basic screening test which we have to do for any child who is suspected to have a bleeding disorder. Anything you want to
So
add?
yeah, I was just going to add to that. I mean, people sometimes forget that hemophilia, most of these are de novo mutations, so there's no family history. So when you get the severe hemophiliacs, they're going to bleed out of the blue. And the PTT is usually diagnostic in the sense it's significantly prolonged. Now, we know newborns often have mildly prolonged PTT, so that in itself is not uncommon. But these patients will usually have a PTT that's about 2 to 3 times the upper level of normal. So it's not, but you don't know if it's factor 8 or factor 9. And at that point in time, so yes, all the other workup is needed. And as you point out, waiting is not going to help anyone because they will stop bleeding and then they'll start again after a few hours because that's what hemophiliacs do. Please.
In fact, I had a child where preoperative workup was normal. Of all the things, I did a hypospedia surgery where I expected to bleed but did not bleed. Compression dressing given, all right. But next day, child started bleeding. And the bleeding was quite excessive because there is extensive raw surface which was reoperated. So I had to give the child as a blanket FFP because we couldn't get anything. And then, obviously, we had to wait and then we had to work up. So what do you do in such a situation?
So that is actually 2 next questions I wanted to get in. One, when the pre-op investigation is done, either because it is a protocol which is followed as a routine and there is no history and it is normal and then you have bleeding. And number 2, when it is an emergency situation and you actually end up transfusing, will that affect the evaluation results?
Well, yes, it's going to affect your result to some extent. But there's no question if you're giving FFP and you're arbitrarily giving, I mean, I don't know what in this case was given empirically.
Ramesh?
Empirically, you said you treated this patient for a possible bleeding disorder. What did you actually give as far as...
We gave fresh frozen plasma.
Right, right.
And then put compression dressing work. But then again, there was a little raw surface, it started losing. So
Right.
finally we got it controlled because I put a collagen dressing and just let it dry.
So if this patient truly had an underlying bleeding disorder, you're not going to correct the values fully,
Okay.
but just with FFP and cryo. So you can still draw lab values immediately if you have a patient who's bleeding. You don't have to wait for the effect of what you've given to kind of wear off. You may need to wait to get a little more accurate idea as to what exactly they have. So I had a couple of questions, though. You said the pre-op values were completely normal.
Pre-operative routinely I do a prothrombin time and sometimes bleeding time, clotting time, but I've stopped off late.
So did you do a PTT?
No.
That is probably the most useful test you can do because a prothrombin time will help if you have liver dysfunction, but it's probably not going to be relevant for most of the common bleeding disorders we encounter. So if you do want to screen, and I'm not saying you should be screening, but if you are concerned about screening, you should do a partial thromboplastin time, a PTT. That is what will pick up your hemophiliac patients. A PT, a normal PT, doesn't really tell you that much about the extrinsic intrinsic pathway, sorry.
But practically what happens is in my, for example, our institute, there's some lab error. PTT is generally prolonged for most of the cases.
I think I'll answer that. We had this exercise.
I've never
We
seen
have a
normal PTT
neonatal
ever.
surgical ICU.
Right.
So the same problems because the way they collect it and the amount of mixing is not
So
proper.
the way you collect it,
Has to be proper. The
Right.
the mixture, the citrate and the blood sample, the ratio has to be proper.
And finally, when we actually went back and saw, then we asked them to give us the pediatric vacuotinase because
Right.
it is easier to collect lesser volume. And they gave us a box of 100 And of those, some of them didn't have the meniscus at all, some of them had a half a meniscus, and some of them had correct. So it is very difficult to expect the sisters to know which is a correct vial and which is not. So like I said, it is a lot of lab and technical reasons also when you keep getting, or you keep getting reports which are blood is clotted, please send one more sample, blood is clotted, please send one more sample, and finally we get fed up and said, okay, we'll just go ahead.
But that is probably an important take-home lesson, I think, for all labs and surgical ICUs dealing with coagulation issues, because technical issues, if most of the patients we got referred to us, 80–90%, if you take the sample correctly, the prolonged PTT went away. And these are usually marginally prolonged or mildly prolonged.
And same thing which used to have for platelet counts in the newborns. Sometime when they're collecting, there's a little small clot already forming, platelet is consumed. Will always. So we do get many times platelet count being low, but there's clinically nothing. Dr. Shekhar, I think most of these other questions I planned for you are answered, but for the completion, when we do a PT-PTT, when there's been some history of coagulopathy, is there any correlation with the expected intraoperative bleeding and the cutoffs? How much is going to be worrisome, and is there any preoperative treatment we need to give?
You're taking a patient for tonsillectomy, and then you're doing a clotting profile, blood count, PT, APTT, and you find that the APTT is abnormal. Let's say, to give an example of this. So what would I do? So often this referral comes to the hematology team as to say, please advise. So when I approach, I would do this, blood history, etc., and to see whether there is any concern. So if there's no trigger on the history and physical examination, then the first action is to repeat the sample. And often what I would like to do is our team collect the sample directly and take it to the lab and get it tested personally. Now let's say that the abnormality still persists. Now this is a problem. So in this problem, what is the abnormal? Even subtle abnormalities, they persist. In my opinion, typically it's about, people say about 1.5 times threshold values above the APTT above. We don't use INR because INR is for vitamin K treated, warfarin treated patients. So again, about 1.25 to 1.5 times the lab reference value is what people say, but I'm not so sure whether these cutoffs are hard. So in that situation, what I do is often, if it's an elective procedure, we tell the physicians to hold until we investigate. And the investigation then includes a global test of hemostasis, including a thrombin time, and then directed testing based on which abnormality is there. If there is, what I want to say is that if it's an emergency procedure and you have to go ahead, then you have to use your clinical judgment and say, okay, APTT is abnormal, procedure has to go ahead. Please give, I think the common things are related to the intrinsic pathway, so cryo and FFP probably. So like that kind of has to be done, and then later we will work it up later. Something like this has to be. That's my pragmatic answer to this problem.
When we have children with liver disease, most of the time we do get, cholestasis children and colorectal cyst with already liver being compromised. We do a PT-INR. Does the PT-INR derangement actually predict the risk of bleeding?
Indeed. So the prothrombin time I would correct because it is probably cholestatic disorder, so vitamin K dependence, etc. But the global test of hemostasis here, PT-APTT, is not predictive because actually there is a problem of thrombosis versus, in the non-cholestatic liver failure situation, my personal experience with, especially when supporting liver transplant patients, etc., is that the PT-APTT is not predictive, and sometimes, in fact, they have a thrombotic risk rather than a bleeding risk. And I do not know what test of hemostasis can predict that. So I think in that situation, I do not react to the laboratory tests. Rather, I react to the clinical situation. That's my opinion.
So suppose we have, for example, a biliary atresia patient whose PT is deranged, and usually the thing what we would do is give vitamin K and try to repeat it and see whether it resolves. And if it doesn't, do we really need to give FFP or just keep it standby, and if there is a perioperative problem, then use it?
That's a very interesting question. That's a tricky one because biliary atresia patient has got esophageal varices, risk of bleeding. How will you manage? It's a difficult question to answer. I'm not sure. I'll give you my take on this. I will give vitamin K, and I will not react to that particular result. And I would react with fresh frozen plasma. I would treat with fresh frozen plasma in a reactive manner, not in a prophylactic manner. That is my answer, but I'm not sure whether people.
No, I agree 100% because part of the issue is that if somebody with liver disease is going to surgery, most of what you do is probably not going to fix their coagulation system. If they have deranged, you don't get deranged coagulation till you've lost about 80 to 90%. So these are patients who are usually cirrhotic, usually have a lot of liver dysfunction, liver damage. And so, yes, you can give vitamin K, but giving prophylactic FFP is going to treat the physician more than the patient. It makes you feel you've done something, but really it's more to salvage them if they do start to ooze and bleed. I don't know if...
No, I agree, but I think most surgical practice is that give a vitamin K and give FFP. That's what...
I think that is more because of the anesthetist demand for it.
That's exactly. The anesthetists push you for correcting the coagulogram, and they'll just write one line that optimize the patient in terms of coagulopathy.
I hope there are no anesthetists here.
And yeah, that's why I'm being free with this.
I think they're fled for tea.
Because this was a very interesting anecdote long back during my residency when one of our professors had finished his liver transplant training and gung-ho and wanted to start off. So there was one indication, inpatient trying in the pediatric ward, and he asked the resident to just write a reference to the anesthetist for considering evaluation for liver transplant workup. So the anesthesia resident was sent, discussed with chief. Chief said, please go and write correct PT.
Yeah, so they just want to correct the investigation and have a correct investigation. But I agree that for biliary atresia or I'll just take an example, sir, if I may, of portal hypertension. So in a case like portal hypertension, which is a little more advanced from biliary atresia from the physiology point of view, I think which has hypersplenism and pancytopenias, and you're worried about, the anesthetists are worried about epidurals, they're worried about lines, all those things intraoperatively. So what practice in our institution is that we arrange for adequate amount of blood, FFP, platelets, and then we go ahead and, as soon as the splenic artery is ligated, you go ahead and transfuse all the platelets, all the FFP which you have on hand, and that would kind of help the anesthetist in the perioperative period. So there are different clinical situations and different scenarios in which you would react differently. But prophylactically, just giving PT to placate the anesthetist, we need to do it sometimes, but I don't know.
I think we have gone well over the first half an hour which are reserved, thinking that there's nothing much to discuss on this. So just a couple of statements which I got when you're trying to look at guidelines, which still shows how much of confusion and things are there. So one was that postoperative bleeding rates in pediatric patients with and without prolonged clotting time were found to be similar. And bleeding rates for patients who had abnormal coagulation test and without abnormal coagulation test were also similar. So these are large studies, meta-analysis which were done. And when finally tried to look at guidelines, the nearest sensible thing what I could manage to get was the 2016 NICE guidelines. That is the UK guidelines, which classified the pediatric surgeries into minor, intermediate, and major groups. And in each group, as per ASA 1, 2, 3, 4. And they said that for ASA 1 and 2, irrespective of whatever surgeries, no hematological workup or hemostatic workup was required as a pre-op evaluation. And for major and complex surgery, only a hemoglobin CBC was required. For ASA 3 and 4, no CBC was required or hemostatic workup was required for minor cases, only for major and intermediate CBC. And in all of this, again, the hemostatic work was recommended only if there were comorbid conditions like liver, etc., or there is a history. So I thought this was something which summarized most of the thing. And if any of you want to add on something to this, I'll go on. Otherwise, I'll proceed to the next topic. So the next one is about rational use of blood products in surgical patients. We do get situations where anesthetists ask blood to be reserved. We are doing anorectoplasty. They want blood to be reserved for that. And sometimes when you are busy operating, one of the residents does order for blood and transfuses 20 ml, 15 ml Paxils, and then tells, we have transfused blood. Then you ask them how much it is, a 10 kg child. We gave 20 ml blood. So you're neither here nor there. So Nitin, Is there any protocol, again, in your institution or department for reserving blood or deferring surgery depending on the hemoglobin, depending on the type of surgery or hemoglobin levels, respectively?
Right. So I'll answer the hemoglobin point first. I mean, it comes down to what kind of clinical situation you are in. A patient coming in for a hypospadias, our general cutoff would be something like a 9. You have to see that the socioeconomic strata of patients which you're treating, the nutritional assessment, and obviously microcytic hyperchromic anemias and worm infestations. So all those things, we don't expect that the hemoglobin would rise more than maybe 8.5 or 9. If you have a patient of anorectal malformation, and like you asked that you want to do anorectal plasty, then that fellow with a colostomy and on breastfeed will never have a hemoglobin more than 8 in our settings. So you have to kind of, have a balance. And so our hemoglobin cutoffs, there's no trigger hemoglobin that it's 9, otherwise we won't get it operated. So it depends on the situation. I think it's around 8 for diseases where we have nutritional issues and disease-specific issues, and maybe around 9 for well patients who are coming in from the OPD for daycare kind of procedures. Blood, well, you're right that even for hydrocephalus and VP shunt, our anesthetist insists that there is a blood available and they will not take the patient in. However, I think there is an important role of transfusion medicine, and there's an important role of institutional policy where you need to sit down and discuss how much is required. And so there are cases, in our department, we've kind of classified them into 3 categories, and one is where no blood is like daycare surgeries. The other is where we have like a pyeloplasty in an infant or a neonate undergoing pyloromyotomy. We cross-match the blood but don't get it issued from the blood bank. So that kind of does not spoil the blood coming out of the blood bank and maybe used for somebody else. And the third category is patients where you definitely would anticipate blood loss and blood transfusion intraoperatively or perioperatively, where it is issued from the blood bank and brought to the operating room. So these are the broad categories how we do it.
Now, when you have a major surgery and you have actually reserved blood, who decides when to give the transfusion? Does the anesthetist or the surgeon? Or if the anesthetist, is there any something specific reason parameter they follow when to transfuse, or is it just a random?
So I think if it's preoperatively and it's a major case and there is some issues with the hemoglobin being very less, then they would discuss it with us and say that you transfuse and let's wait for another week. Or let's wait for some more time, because just transfusing one day prior to a major surgery won't really help. So that's what happens. Otherwise, intraoperatively, I think the most important thing to have intraoperatively is an excellent communication with the anesthetist who's on the other side of the table. And there are various surgical and anesthetic or operating room measures to kind of see how much blood is being lost. So how many gauze pieces are being used? How many mops are being used? Are you able to weigh them? Do you have a weighing machine? How much fluid is there in the suction? And we should not forget how much the sister is used for irrigation. So, those things need to be tabulated. This is from the surgical point of view. And the anesthetist usually would have, for a major case, they would have an arterial line. So their monitoring parameters would also kind of give you a clue that whether you've reached the maximum allowable blood loss and whether you need to transfuse. So it's always, I think the key to it is communication and say that, okay, now yes, we can go ahead and transfuse, or let's hold on. Or,
I think the WHO safety checklist very clearly says when you need blood. One of the things which is read out is
estimated
the
blood
loss is more than 10%, or more than 7 ml per kg, and if so, his blood is reserved. Okay, Dr. Shekhar, now we keep talking about blood being given, and it's sometimes is taken as a very routine thing. But what are the actual risks associated with blood transfusions? Some of the things we all, I've been as students reading about it, reactions, etc., infections and all. But there are now lots of other newer guidelines, newer reasons which have come up with respect to immunological consequences of blood transfusions, etc. So what are the things we need to keep in mind when we order blood transfusions?
So the main point for us as hematologists looking after children is that blood transfusion is the major risk is a biohazardous product. And that is why we are very, very conservative about transfusing blood unless it's required. So from my perspective as a physician looking after patients, I think this is my primary concern. I know there are other concerns about the immunological consequences on cancer treatment, etc. These do not weigh on my mind. So the primary concern for me as a physician is first is the risk transfusion transmitted infections, even in situations where you have advanced testing for viral pathogens. Number one. Number two is the risk of volume overload, and this is the second reason why I become conservative when transfusing blood products to patients. Is the risk to volume. The third is especially when you use cellular products, is the risk of transfusion-related acute lung injury. Not an uncommon problem, and sometimes difficult to distinguish from volume overload-related lung edema. But it is not. When you look for it, you find it. So this is the third reason why I is concerned. The fourth reason, of course, is sometimes the rare risk of serious hazards of transfusion. For instance, mismatched blood. So, of course, that is an institutional hemovigilance problem, but something to be always mindful about. But for me, the primary thing is the infection transmission. My colleagues.
No, I think you've hit the main highlights on that. I mean, things like Trally, for example, which in the adult world are very sort of, in pediatric transfusion medicine, for whatever reason, we're aware of it, but we don't see it quite so often as the adults do. But the rest really is that even though blood now is NAT tested at most centers, but you still have a window period, you still have a risk. And a lot of us don't always have access to one designated or dedicated transfusion center. So there's always that concern. Things have improved over the years. The risk has gone way down compared to what it used to be, say, 20 years ago or even 10 years ago. But that concern is always there. As far as transfusion goes in general, amongst non-pediatricians, there's very little knowledge about how much blood to give a child, especially an infant. I've come across children 5 or 10 kilograms who've been cheerfully given like 1 unit of packed red cells over a 3-hour period. And I'm looking at this child's hemoglobin is like 14 or something. It's like so some of the difficulty is that adult hematologists managing children or adult physicians or physicians who just have less sort of pediatric experience managing children and then transfusing them. So they just assume, okay, an adult gets 2, child get 1, and a small child will just give 1 and be done with that. And I think it's simple, small things which are a significant concern.
Dr. Vikramjit, again, is there any threshold hemoglobin which you would want to transfuse in a planned surgery? Most of them, because in Indian situation, most of them are nutritional anemias, iron deficiencies.
Sure.
So do we really need to chase and transfuse and operate, or if there are surgeries which are
planned?
Well,
it depends. If this is an elective surgery, then let's say it's somebody with iron deficiency and their hemoglobin is 5, you don't have to transfuse them. You can treat them for iron deficiency. If this is truly elective and it's something that can wait a few weeks, treat them for iron deficiency and then recheck their hemoglobin after a few weeks. It'll come up to 7 or 8. What is your threshold? I think most anesthesiologists are happy with a hemoglobin of 7 to 8. Unless you're going in for some very morbid sort of, dissection, etc. The only times you're really going to be transfusing is if you have somebody, say, with a solid tumor or some other scenario where you feel compelled to go in sooner and you don't have the luxury of waiting around. Because remember, even if you transfuse somebody, most of these patients are hemodynamically stable. Let's say somebody has chronic anemia for whatever reason. When you transfuse them, it takes a while for them to adjust and settle down. It's not like you can transfuse them and then just take them straight to the OR, immediately. So I don't know, what's been your experience?
So in the operating room, we do set a threshold hemoglobin usually, depending on the surgery and depending on the preoperative condition of the child. And from there, you kind of calculate the maximum allowable blood loss. There are various formulae for that, and you look at the something like a neuroblastoma surgery, say, and you have set your estimated your maximum allowable at a hematocrit of maybe at a hemoglobin of maybe 8. So you have a anticipated value there, and you have a preoperative value, and there are enough formulae which the anesthetist used. And the problem and the challenge in pediatric patients, and especially in smaller babies, is that what the adult surgeons and as general surgeons, what we used to do was calculate the volume of blood depending on the hematocrit of the bag and go ahead and transfuse. But for pediatric patients, I think you need to work backwards. You need to figure out the volume which you can give in consideration with the fluid and electrolyte homeostasis intraoperatively, and then look at the value which you need to achieve. And so, like in larger surgeries where there's anticipated blood loss, our anesthetist would always put an arterial line and would get blood gas maybe every hour or every 2 hourly to kind of say where we have reached, and with the other parameters decide on how much to transfuse.
The blood loss.
So
Shouldn't that be more of a criteria than just the number of the tolerable blood loss?
So I'll go back to my first point, which I said was that the most important parameter is communication with the anesthetist, and their monitoring. I mean, the monitoring which they do for various cases is also staged. So it can be a simple monitoring as a hemodynamic monitoring or a pulse oximetry, and that's what they would be happy with. In a different case, their monitoring would be maybe arterial lines or central lines, central venous pressures. In an even more extensive case, now we've come up with new kind of pulse oximeters which are like the Missimo and all those things. So, or the pulse variability index, all those parameters along with the clinical situation. Suppose the patient is having tachycardia, his fluid requirement has been fulfilled. In taking into consideration your third space losses and in taking into consideration preoperative fasting and all those parameters, and still you're having the pain part is taken care of with fentanyl or whatever, and you're still having an unexplained tachycardia, even though your allowable blood loss levels may not have been reached, but sometimes you would like to transfuse to get a hemodynamic stability intraoperatively.
That's one aspect of it. The other is he's exceeded the tolerable blood loss, but he's hemodynamically stable.
Yes, that's.
Then you wait till what? What would you wait till?
That's again difficult, and I think the answer to that would be to reassess with hemoglobins and PCVs, and then postoperatively transfuse. And we all know that intraoperative and perioperative transfusions have higher morbidity in any kind of surgical setting. So we see how.
To just add to that, when you have, for example, a threshold of 7, and his hemoglobin to start off with was 10, and with allowable blood loss, even crossing allowable blood loss is still not going to come to the lower threshold. So you can still continue to wait, and based on his clinical scenario, and then decide whether it really is required. So I don't think it's one absolute parameter, but it's a whole.
So the anesthetists tend to go by that tolerable blood loss. They tend to go that, and once they've exceeded that, they'll keep needling.
So that is where I think each institution has to sit with the respective people involved in patient care and come up with guidelines, which is a consensus for those.
I also think it depends on what the surgery is and whether you're going to put the child on ventilator or you want the child to be extubated, you would like a decent hemoglobin. And nowadays they can do an intra-op hemoglobin quickly and decide.
Yes.
And of course the anesthetist, I can understand their point of view. They don't want the child to deteriorate. They want a stable child. They want the vitals to be stable. They don't want to be running around for blood once the BP has dropped and crashed and things like that. So probably that's the reason why they are. And of course, it has to be individualized. We cannot have a broad guideline. Of course, guidelines we can have, but it cannot be a rules.
I think most of the other questions we have covered in the discussion. Just one thing about when major blood losses are taking place and they give lots of transfusions. What are the recommendations for massive blood loss? How much Paxils and what is the ratio of FFP or cryo or platelets to be given when we are giving too many Paxils? Is there any specific guideline for that?
So this requires a proper protocol or guidelines. So massive transfusion protocols, every institution normally has those drawn up, because once you go beyond, if you have patients who are actively bleeding and you're replacing multiple units of blood, you get into issues with DIC, other consumption coagulopathies, etc. Plus just the fact that you're giving out of citrated blood. So having an MTP in place, massive transfusion protocol, is essential for any institution which deals with patients who are having trauma, massive blood loss, etc. Shekhar, I don't know if you guys already have one.
So usually it's 1:1:1 of blood, FFP and platelet, which works. So that's the protocol followed at most of the places, and that's the one recommended because that will prevent that coagulopathy and thrombocytopenia. It will take care.
But that's not invariable. So it's going to depend a little bit on the clinical parameters of the patient as well.
Yeah, they have to keep following up. They have to monitor the coagulation profile, and they have to monitor the CBC as well as they are treating the patient during a polytrauma situation or when there is multiple blood transfusion required.
Any other questions from the audience? If not,
I think we've bludgeoned the audience into submission. There's complete and utter silence.
Thank you very much. I think that we'll wind up with this session.